Opening the center immediately establishes attacking potential and claims space for future development. Preparing for solid pawn structure, black opens the door for the queen's bishop and prepares a flexible pawn center. Establishing central dominion, white immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims to open lines for piece development. Instantly challenging the center with this pawn thrust creates dynamic play and opens possibilities for both sides. Developing the knight now contests central squares and prepares for kingside castling, a standard and aggressive approach. Developing the knight to f6 solidifies the center and prepares for kingside castling, a natural response to white's aggressive pawn push. Sacrificing the center pawn for open lines and potential attacking chances is a bold choice, inviting a dynamic struggle. Recapturing the pawn opens lines, fostering active piece play for black. Establishing immediate pressure on d5, this bishop aims to harass the pawn chain and prepare for potential sacrifices. Solidifying the center and preparing development, this move often aims to unlock the c8 bishop. Preparing to eye the queen side, this queen repositioning opens lines for piece development and supports an eventual queenside expansion. Exposing the bishop to attack, this maneuver seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and create tactical opportunities by potentially exchanging pieces. Positioning the bishop here solidifies the center and prepares for queenside castling, aiming for a comfortable development. Securing the pawn structure while preparing to develop the queenside knight sets the stage for balanced play. Challenging black's bishop on b4 forces a decision, potentially gaining tempo if it retreats or creating weaknesses if it exchanges. Relocating the bishop to the flank creates a subtle diagonal threat, preparing a future kingside advance by maintaining piece tension. Developing knights often stabilizes the center and prepares castling, reinforcing the central pawn structure. Developing the knight to d7 neatly fortifies the central pawn and prepares for castling, a sensible consolidation. Securing the king's safety establishes a solid foundation for future operations. Completing king safety, black ensures their monarch is shielded behind pawns, preparing for the upcoming middle game skirmish. Shielding the king from potential bishop diagonal threats, white prepares for quieter maneuvering, aiming to consolidate and avoid early complications. Presents a dynamic central presence, bolstering the pawn chain and preparing to contest open files for potential skirmishes. Expanding the queenside establishes a pawn lever, aiming to dislodge the active black bishop and claim more space. Retreating the bishop allows for a passive defense, relinquishing the influential diagonal it once controlled. A strategic repositioning, the rook now eyes the central files, creating potential pressure on black's pawn structure. Rerouting the knight to a more active square, f8 offers flexibility for future maneuvers while preparing to contest the e-file. Lifting the knight to the edge opens a path to exchange pieces and perhaps gain a slight advantage on the queen side, while also preparing a strategic redeployment. Knight repositioning to g6 aims to challenge white's influential bishop on f4 and potentially open lines for attack. Clearing the path for the king's rook to potentially exploit the now unguarded e-file, while subtly reinforcing the bishop's active post. Regrouping the bishop to c7 aims to reinforce the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances on that wing. Asserting influence on the queenside, this knight now eyes vulnerable squares and prompts black's response to its imposing presence. Exchanging the bishop eliminates a key defender of white's kingside, opening avenues for future action. Reclaiming the knight opens up the f-file, aiming to pressure the enemy king through centralized control. Recapturing the bishop to c8 relinquishes precious central control and concedes passive piece placement, hindering any immediate counterplay. Sacrificing the exchange to simplify and seize the open e-file for the rook offers significant dynamic potential. Returning the knight to its own territory clears the e-file, preparing for potential counterplay and solidifying the center. White aims to secure the queenside pawns and potentially open the file for a rook. Challenging the kingside pawn wall aims to open lines, but risks isolating the pawn and weakening the queenside structure. Securing the central space is now the priority, preventing black's pawns from advancing further. The queen's repositioning aims to challenge the pawn structure and find active squares, but risks becoming a target itself. Simplifying to an endgame that favors white's active pieces, aiming to exploit black's slightly awkward bishop placement. Reclaiming the file with the rook offers a more active piece in this evolving queensless middle game structure. Controlling the b-file opens avenues for piece activity, aiming to penetrate black's weakened queenside structure. Unblocking the d-file for white's remaining rook now becomes black's pressing concern. The bishop exchange simplifies, opening lines and potentially simplifying toward an endgame where piece activity reigns supreme. Opening that h-file now gives your king breathing room and a potential infiltration route. Repositioning the knight prepares to contest the open file and potentially create attacking chances on the queenside. The rook now aims to activate itself on the file, potentially challenging white's newly acquired pawn majority. Unlocking the knight's potential on the kingside, aiming for a decisive central breakthrough. Reactivating the bishop to its active diagonal reclaims some central influence. Anchoring the rook to the second rank solidifies the central pawns and prepares for potential pawn pushes. Recapturing the bishop on c8 immediately regains material equality and prepares for potential pawn breaks on the kingside. Unlocking the kingside pawns initiates a potential race for central space and piece activity. Securing the king's safety from potential knight incursions now takes precedence over pawn structure concerns. Seizing the initiative, this advance opens lines and pressures black's queenside structure. Unlocking the central files after the queen trade allows the king to finally step into the fray, seeking shelter from potential pawn storms. Launching a pawn storm on the kingside to open lines, but beware of weakening your own king's defenses. Seeking active play, black repositions the rook to influence the central files. Probing the queenside, white aims to liberate the rook, targeting potential pawn weaknesses with this repositioning. The monarch's journey to the center is finally underway, aiming to activate it. Reclaiming the e-file offers centralizing pressure and better piece placement for the rook. Securing the pawn majority on the queenside, black aims to create a passed pawn and gain space for counterplay. Sacrificing a knight to clear a path for the king feels desperate, but might force a breakthrough. This king boldly seeks safety and a fresh start in the center after the exchange sacrifice, aiming to rejoin the fray. Asserting control over the d4 square and aiming to restrict black's queen activity after the exchange sequence. Opening the center this way invites a knight infiltration, potentially creating imbalances. Capturing that pawn opens a vital diagonal for your rook and simplifies the pawn structure. Liberating the bishop from its pawn escort could awaken dormant threats on the queenside. Capturing that pawn with check unleashes your knight and cracks open the position for your remaining pieces. The king's forced march to the center now opens up critical attacking avenues for white's remaining pawns. This rook shift initiates a fascinating endgame dance, aiming to pin down black's isolated pawns and exploit the open files. Initiating a spirited counterattack to dislodge white's rook and reclaim central influence. Centralizing the monarch initiates a more active endgame for the king, aiming to support the pawns and potentially harass black's pieces. Seizing the central d-file opens lines and creates dynamic possibilities in this complex middle game. Repositioning the rook to the active d-file, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially infiltrate. Opening the queenside with this capture allows your king more central breathing room. Clearing the path forces the king into a more exposed position, disrupting its defensive setup. The king's exposed position becomes a significant liability, inviting relentless pressure. Solidifying the central pawn structure after the exchange opens pathways for your remaining pieces. This aggressive knight sortie aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, but it overlooks the immediate danger to black's king, initiating a decisive kingside hunt, forcing the opposing monarch into a vulnerable position across the board. The black king scrambles for safety, but the advanced pawns and active white rook create suffocating pressure. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, ready to jump into the fray and influence the center. A critical juncture arises. Consolidating the king's safety becomes paramount before venturing further. The rook's repositioning aims to fortify the pawn chain and potentially exert pressure on the king side. The black rook, finally finding active post on the second rank, now eyes white's vulnerable pawns. Relinquishing the c-file allows black to activate their rook, pressuring white's isolated d-pawn. Repositioning the rook to a3 offers a potential outflanking maneuver, aiming to disturb white's pawn structure. Repositioning the knight allows it to potentially attack the passed pawn's escort on the king side, or support a breakthrough on the queen side. The knight's relocation aims to menace the c3 pawn and potentially disrupt white's coordinating pieces on the queen side. Solidifying the king's position is paramount as this rook endgame nears its decisive phase. Doubling down on the pawn structure, black aims to consolidate on the queen side with this pawn advance. Bringing the rook to the back rank now aims to create havoc and disrupt black's coordinated pieces. Unleashing a pawn storm aims to disrupt white's king's safety and gain space on the queen side. Pushing the g-pawn creates a strong passed pawn, aiming to restrict black's king and open lines for attack. The bishop vacates the c4 square, potentially preparing to support a pawn advance or redeploy to a more active diagonal. The white king is now exposed to a mating net as the rook swoops in for a final, decisive check. Recentralizing the king offers better defense against the upcoming checks and prepares for a potential counterattack on the king side. Initiating a calculated push of the kingside pawns to gain space and restrict black's bishop mobility. A timely repositioning, aiming to disrupt white's control and potentially snag that passed pawn. The king's exposed position invites a decisive attack. Forcing a check is the logical next step. King's escape route now exposed to a deadly diagonal from the rook. Unlocking the king's escape route through the open diagonal offers immediate tactical advantages.